Beg your pardon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Wilbert Mokori. Tonight I would like to go to the central issue of why Zimbabwe, why we are stuck. Zimbabwe is a failed state, and why are we stuck? At the heart of this problem is the failure to realize what the true purpose of the opposition is. To define what is it we want the opposition to do. Why do we need the opposition? To put it simply, by the late 1990s, many people in Zimbabwe had come to the realization that Zanu PF was a corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical regime. But as long as the party remained in power, the people were helpless to stop the rot. It was an important realization. And the solution was we have to implement the democratic reforms necessary to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections and staying in power. That was equally important. Unfortunately, not many people understood what those democratic reforms are. And when they elected the opposition, they were elected on the basis that they would implement these democratic reforms. But alas, they, the opposition leaders, most of them, had no clue what those democratic reforms are, much less the people. Yes, when MDC was founded, one of their favorite slogan was change. And yet, most people had no clue what that change is. This has been at the heart of our problem in Zimbabwe, but in Africa in general. We have failed to define our problems, to go into detail, to understand the detail of what the problem is, and therefore then the detail of what the solution should be. Like somebody once said, the devil is in the detail. They were absolutely right. If you do not understand the detail, and you're discussing a problem at a superficial level, you can discuss it until kingdom come without ever coming to any meaningful resolution. Because, to be quite honest, you have never understood the problem. And therefore, then they fail to define the solution. And so here we are. This issue of we need democratic change started in the late 1990s. 30 years later, we are still talking of we need change. We need reforms. Because 30 years ago, when we first muted the idea, we never understood what those reforms are. And we never went to detail what those reforms are meant for and why they're so important, how they were going to be implemented. And even the opposition parties who put themselves forward as the people who would deliver those democratic change have no clue what they're talking about. And the few who did they quickly forgot about it. Because as long as the people themselves have no clue, they can never hold you to account for something that they don't know themselves. Here is a clip that has been recently recorded. Nelson Chamisa speaking about
will never betray the people. Atina kupinda politics for money, atina kupinda politics for money, atina kupinda politics for positions, atina kupinda politics for parliament seats. Takapinda politics to change the lives of the people of Zimbabwe. Vanoda kuenda endai, vanoda mari taizve mari, vanoda zvigaro taizve zvigaro. Isu tinoita zveugaro hwevanhu. Vakauya Chamisa uya kuita opposition leader, tokupa mota, tokupa motorcade, tokupa mabodyguard. Because for me, that is meaningless. Life is more than wealth. Life is more than money. Life is about a legacy. Life is about service. That's why we are.
Well, there he is, reiterating that he went into politics not for the money, not for the wealth that he was being promised, but to change people's lives. Nelson Chamisa and his movement for democratic change colleagues were elected into power these last 23 years for this primary purpose of implementing the democratic changes necessary to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. That was the primary purpose. And yet, 23 years later, including 5 in the GNU, they failed to implement even one meaningful democratic reform. And yet he claims that that is what is there to change the people's lives. How are you going to change it when you can't even implement the democratic reforms? A few of the MDC leaders during the GNU have admitted that the GNU was a golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms and dismantle the Zanu PF dictatorship. And yes, they took their eyes off the ball. A few days ago, I discussed Atham Tambara, the extract from one of his books, where he was admitting that. It was just one of the few who even bothered to admit it. The rest of them, they've never admitted it. And when you're talking to people like Chamisa, you can ask him that question 1,000 times. He will never answer it. The truth of the matter is, during the GNU, Nelson Chamisa was one of the senior MDC leaders. He was one of the ministers, Minister of Technology. The process of implementing reforms required one of the MPs or senators or ministers or deputy ministers, one of the 2 deputy prime ministers or the prime minister himself to submit a reform proposal in the Senate or in Parliament. That was the process. That was the starting of the reform process. They had 5 years. The GNU itself, when it was formulated, it was meant to last 18 months. It ended up lasting 5 years, 60 months. And yet, at the end of the day, not even one reform proposal was ever submitted. Not even one reform proposal was ever submitted. This is the reality that most Zimbabweans have failed to understand. So if the politicians themselves, if Nelson Chamisa doesn't know what the primary purpose of the reform of him being in power is, and clearly he doesn't, how is he going to deliver that change to the people? It's just politics. It's just lying. Some people have argued that yes, they made a mistake during the GNU, implying that they've learned from that mistake. The truth of the matter is they've not learned anything at all. I would forgive the politicians even if they didn't admit that they'd made a mistake or they'd let down the people by failing to implement even one reform. If they at least quietly admitted that and resolved not to repeat it. The truth of the matter is they haven't. One of the reasons why the opposition has stubbornly insisted on participating in these flawed elections is greed. They knew, in fact, one of them, David Coulthard, and I've quoted it on one of these programs several times, wrote in his book that the election process in 2013 was so flawed, so illegal, the only sensible thing to have done then was to withdraw. But they could not withdraw. Why? Because they also knew that Zanu PF would be giving away a few Graviton seats to the few who participate. And for that reason, they participated. And they've been participating for the same reason ever since. Even these 2023 elections, Nelson Chamisa himself was the one who was telling the people that he had plugged all the vote rigging holes. Of course, he knew he had not plugged any vote rigging holes. He knew that. How many times was he told that without a verified voters' roll, Zanu PF will rig these elections? He knew Zanu PF had already got underway its own program to frog march, particularly the rural voters, to attend Zanu PF rallies and then to vote for the party. He had not plugged those holes. Indeed, he failed to plug even some of the obvious ones. Things like making sure that you've got an election agent, at least to stop some of the blatant cheating that takes place on the voting day and the counting and so forth. By deploying an election agent at each polling station. He did not do that. Many people have confirmed that the party had actually received the money to pay for it. So they cannot say they didn't have the money for it. They had the money for it, but they failed to do it. So they've not learned anything from the failure to implement reforms during the GNU. This is why we are where we are. He's now talking about, oh, I'm not going to accept any position, because they're now talking of having a government of national unity. The truth of the matter is the damage has been done. He's joining up with Mnangagwa is neither here or there. The damage is done. Today, there were by-elections. And in many of those by-elections, the CCC candidate, and most of them had been recalled after the August election because of the internal rivalry within CCC itself, found themselves their name being taken off because the party that this faction that had sponsored their recall was saying that they do not qualify to stand. This is chaos that was born out of the chaos within the opposition itself. He has been calling for dialogue with Mnangagwa, and he claims it's for the good of the people. These elections, the August elections, were flawed. He participated in them out of greed. He participated in them knowing fully well that by participating, you're giving Zanu PF legitimacy. Now that he's given Zanu PF legitimacy, what is he talking about? The dialogue that he's talking about to hold with Mnangagwa is of no purpose whatsoever. Zimbabwe right now has no legitimate government. Mnangagwa alone wasted a staggering $5 billion plus in buying votes, busing the hired crowd and feeding it at various party rallies, buying cars for the chiefs and other middle level leaders in the country to support Zanu PF. And for the top, those at the very top of society, the judges, they got a staggering $400,000 bribe. $400,000. All the country's judges received that. And those of a similar level received that. So the country, Mnangagwa alone blew as much as $5 billion. And this is a country, one of the poorest, at least in terms of the poverty of the ordinary person. It's sad. At the end of the day, the AU, the regional body itself, SADC's own election observers, and even Zimbabwe's own Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission dismissed the whole election process as a farce. So we spend all this money, and at the end of the day, come up with a process that is so flawed and illegal, it fails to produce a legal regime. And the pretenders who are in now, they are no more than Vadiripo, foreigners who have imposed themselves on a situation for the sake of looting the country's resources. This by-election was totally uncalled for. ZEC alone is spending a staggering $5 million US. And there's another one coming. On the 3rd of February, there will be another by-election, a result of CCC MPs and councillors and senators being recalled as a result of this in-house factional fighting within CCC. And the leader has got the audacity to still proclaim that he is here to save the people. It's disappointing. The only reason why, of course, the people still support it and cheer him is that they themselves do not have a clue. What is it exactly that the opposition is supposed to do? Deliver change, yes. What are those changes? How are those changes to be delivered? If the ordinary people understood what the reforms are, why we need them, and the consequences of failing to implement those reforms, they would realize that Nelson Chamisa and these MDC friends sold out big time during the GNU. And they would stop this nauseating support of the opposition. But as long as they don't know, they will keep on supporting the party. And meanwhile, not only has it failed to implement any reforms, it is participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy and thus perpetuate the dictatorship. We, the people, have become our own worst enemy because of our ignorance, because of our naivety, because we're gullible. Like it or not, democracy does not work as long as the electorate are not educated. As long as the electorate do not understand the issues at stake. What's the point of giving them power? Democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. They, the people, have the power. What's the point of giving somebody that power when they don't know what it means, how to use it? We have ended up here with buffoons on both sides of the political divide, Zanu PF and the opposition in power. And they've manipulated the electorate to vote for them and to keep them in power. Well, the people think Chamisa is going to deliver change. Chamisa is not delivering any change. This circus that we are in, Chamisa is as much responsible for it as Zanu PF itself. I can't overemphasize the need for the people to open their eyes and their minds and ask themselves, what is it exactly we want the opposition to do? Cannot be overemphasized. If you don't know the details of what the opposition is supposed to do, how are you going to make sure that you've got the opposition that will do the work that you want? It's not enough to say we want change. What kind of change do you want? How is that change going to be brought about? Why have we failed to see any meaningful change from the MDC/CCC? They have been on the political stage now for 23 years, 5 of which in the GNU. What changes have they brought? To focus on Zanu PF as, oh, the Zanu PF is the main problem. It is the main problem. People realized that in the late 1990s. But they also realized that as long as Zanu PF is able to rig elections, they will never be able to remove Zanu PF from office, from power. The only sure way to remove Zanu PF from power is to make sure we implement the democratic reforms. Zanu PF itself was never going to reform itself out of power. So we need an opposition to implement those reforms. And people have risked life and limb and livelihoods to elect the opposition for that primary purpose, to implement the democratic changes necessary to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. Zanu PF has just rigged the 2023 elections because no meaningful reforms were implemented. To keep on hoping that CCC will implement the reforms is being naive. They failed to implement even one meaningful reform during the GNU when they had the golden opportunity to do so. What makes you think they will do so now? During the GNU, MDC had one trump card up its sleeve, SADC. SADC were the guarantor of the global political agreement. Now, this talk that Chamisa is talking about, he wants a dialogue with Mnangagwa. They want to form a government of national unity. To do what? Without SADC, if they fail to implement even one meaningful reform, when SADC was the guarantor, what hope is there that they will do so now? Particularly when you're talking of an opposition that is so divided that they are fighting among themselves right now. The number one task, the biggest challenge, if we're serious about reform in Zimbabwe, is that we must educate the electorate. The electorate must begin to understand what is it the opposition is supposed to do. When you're talking of reforms, what are the reforms we want? What are the consequences of failing to implement those reforms? To believe in Chamisa and his CCC friends that they'll deliver change as a matter of faith is the most naive thing that we can do. The Zimbabwe electorate, I repeat, the Zimbabwe electorate is ignorant, naive, and gullible. That is a serious impediment to change. As long as the opposition knows that the electorate are ignorant, they will exploit that. Zanu PF itself will also exploit that. So we'll be going round and round in circles. It is unforgivable that 45 years after independence, in this day and age, we're still failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Because we failed to define what is it that constitutes free, fair, and credible election. That is our problem. Before I close, I just want to turn to some comments I've got here from Dube. It says, Mukori, tell us what you could do yourself. Then we can move forward. Please let us know. Well, It's not what I can do myself. What I can do myself is educate the electorate. As long as we have got the majority of the people who have got the vote who do not know what is it they're voting for. When they say they're voting for change, are they going to get that change? How are they going to make sure that they get that change? At the present moment, they've been promised change, and none of the changes materialized. The people voted, participated in these recent elections on the belief that CCC would win big, because they believed that Nelson Chamisa had blocked, had plugged all the vote rigging holes. When you've got people who are that naive, I can tell you, there is no end to your problems. They will be exploited. There will be many who will be coming there promising the moon on a silver platter, only to deliver hell. So it's not what I can do, it's what we can all do. Educating the electorate is probably the number one issue that we must carry out now. As long as the electorate are ignorant, naive, and gullible, I can tell you there will be no meaningful change. Another comment there from the same guy is, even if reforms were made in your senses, do you think Zanu PF was going to concede? Well, I think that argument, I've heard it so many times before. If you understand what the reforms are and what they're meant to achieve, then you would not be asking that question. Take, for instance, the issue of making sure that ZEC is independent, is able to carry out and deliver on its constitutional duty to deliver free, fair, and credible elections. If you understand what the reforms are, you would know there are reforms that can be implemented to make ZEC independent, impartial, and able to carry out its task. What is so impossible about Zimbabwe ZEC that cannot be achieved when other countries have achieved the same thing? The police, the same thing. The judiciary, the same thing. Implement the reforms and you get the democratic institutions you want. Implement the reforms in this particular case will also open up the minds of the electorate. One of the key reforms that must be implemented, if we implement the reforms properly, is implementing the reforms that will allow free, fair, and credible elections, but also a free media, freedom of expression, so that the people themselves are given the chance to be educated, to be enlightened, so that when they make the choice, they make the right choice, an informed choice. Not a choice like what they're making now. To go in and participate in an election because you believe that Chamisa has plugged all the vote rigging loopholes is a choice that somebody is making out of ignorance. Because if you knew, if you were well informed, you would have known Chamisa is lying. How could you say you've plugged all the vote rigging holes when you don't even have a verified voters roll? When on election day itself you fail to even make sure that there are election agents there. These questions, the people will be the ones asking them. But because they don't know, they don't understand what these election agencies are supposed to do. How are elections rigged? They have to believe anything that Chamisa tells them. And he was only telling them that lie, and many others, one of them being God is in it, for the sake of hiding the true reason why Chamisa and his friends were hell-bent on participating in these elections, knowing fully well that they're flawed, knowing fully well that they're illegal. Right now, he's talking of negotiating with Mnangagwa because he actually believes that he, Chamisa, can grant Mnangagwa and the regime legitimacy. Between the two of them, they believe that if Chamisa and the rest of his party were to come out tomorrow and say, yes, the elections were free, fair, and credible, that will give Zanu PF. It will not. Legitimacy is derived from winning the majority votes in a free, fair, and credible election process. If the election process itself was flawed and illegal, it's not for the parties involved in that flawed process to negotiate among themselves and grant each other legitimacy. No. This election process, August 2023, failed to produce a legitimate government. That is a historic fact. And all this talk about we need to meet each other, to agree on a vision, is just nonsense. It's not for Chamisa to give Mnangagwa legitimacy. Even if they came together and shook hands, kissed and made up, Zimbabwe will still have an illegitimate regime. That is a fact. At least in the 2008 elections, SADC stepped in the void and were the ones who presided over the Zanu PF and MDC meeting to come up with the global political agreement and the interim political arrangement in the form of the government of national unity. Now the criminals are negotiating and agreeing on how they should proceed. And they're even thinking of pardoning each other. What a fuss. I can tell you that even if they were to meet, the stock of the two leaders will go to Tanzania and they talk it over and come up with some kind of agreement on an interim arrangement to go forward, to take the country forward. Even if SADC elders were to force the two to shake hands, kiss and make up, it is not for Chamisa and Mnangagwa to agree and make themselves legitimate. The process of the August 23rd election failed to produce a legitimate government because the process was flawed. That is the reality. And it is meaningless that those behind the flawed and illegal process are the ones who are coming together now and coming up with pardoning each other and deciding that whatever arrangement they come up with is now legitimate. It's not. And I think that must be made abundantly clear. That is not the case. On that note, thank you very much. I'd like to conclude by re-emphasizing the point I made before, that Zimbabwe is a failed state. One of the reasons for it is that we have got an electorate that is ignorant, naive, and gullible. If you know what the primary task of CCC is, then you would know that with the history of MDC CCC failing to implement even one meaningful reform in the last 23 years, including the 5 in the GNU, you would know that Nelson Chamisa and company will never deliver the democratic reforms that the nation is yearning for. And the sooner the nation walked up to that reality, the sooner we can get out of this mess. Thank you very much for listening, and good night.